But for the purposes of today, I do want to, respond to some of the things you said and then share some of my own thoughts. So in regard to fears on another version of the Patriot Act that will violate our civil liberties, that's a legitimate concern. I'm certainly worried about that. But I think it's also important to put everything in context, even, recent historical context. So in 2009, there was a group of, government officials within the Department of Homeland Security who were tasked with investigating right-wing extremism in the country, which has only grown to be more of a problem, right? Now, the conservatives in Congress were outraged when they found out about this and applied enough pressure to the Obama administration to essentially disband that group of investigators within the Department of Homeland Security. And so what happened following that? We saw right-wing extremism continue to grow within the United States. The FBI has been studying this for years, has been warning about this for years, has referred to this as a concerning national security threat for years. But conservatives have all the power because neoliberal Democrats immediately stand down as soon as they get criticized for even doing the right thing. And so it's led to this moment, right, where this wasn't something that came out of nowhere. I mean, they were on message boards, planning this for weeks. And there were open, transparent threats for weeks. And obviously what we experienced this week in the Capitol was an intentional lack of security and policing to ensure that they kept the Capitol safe, kept, lawmakers safe. It's just horrendous behavior. So now, of course, I'm worried about the pendulum swinging in the extreme opposite direction, where people, due to fear, are going to be welcoming toward policies that do violate our civil liberties and our freedoms. We're going to give government more power to surveil us. But we need to understand why we got to this moment. We got to this moment because of the pathetic, cowardly actions of Obama. All it took was a little bit of pressure from conservative lawmakers for him to advocate for disbanding that group of DHS lawmakers who were investigating right-wing extremism in the country at the time. I want to make that point.
Well, I guess my response to that would be obviously right-wing extremism is a thing that exists, right? And and the question is how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it in a sort of punitive policing militaristic way through agencies like the FBI or DHS? I mean, I see it kind of like the how do you deal with drug cartels? And the United States drug cartels are bad. Chapo Guzman is bad. All these people are bad people and they do bad things. And the response to the presence of drug cartels and the drug trade has been to fight them, just to fight them using our military weapons. And that has not done anything to stop it. It's just created more violence, and it's just created more, it does nothing to solve the problem. And so, my reaction to something like the FBI and the DHS investigating quote unquote right-wing extremism is one of extreme skepticism that they could even that anything like that would be a way to stop things like what we saw in the Capitol. I mean, that's just, I don't think that the punitive response to something like that is going to stop this. In fact, it could probably inflame all of this stuff. I'm just very skeptical of that response.
Nando, I think it's important to have people who are dedicated to foiling plots like what we experienced at the Capitol before they actually happen. And my point is we don't have that at all. I'm not saying to respond in a militaristic fashion, but there needs to be enough intel to at least be prepared for what we experienced this week, right? And one of the other concerns is even with that kind of intel, clearly there were law enforcement officials, Capitol Police specifically, who were expecting this to happen. They were expecting this to happen. The Pentagon reached out to them and asked them 3 days prior to what happened in the Capitol, 3 days prior to this riot, hey, do you guys need, extra people to ensure that we secure the Capitol? They said no, they rejected it. As the riot was underway, U.S. Capitol Police were approached again by the Pentagon. They asked, okay, do you want Do you want additional law enforcement now? Do you want the FBI to be involved? And they said no, they rejected it. And then you see images of, two different types of situations with Capitol Police. On one hand, you had Capitol Police who were legitimately trying to control the situation. And then you had Capitol Police who enabled it. You see them taking literal selfies with these rioters. They were definitely outmanned, right? So I don't begrudge any of the Capitol Police who didn't respond super aggressively, because you don't want to escalate the situation further knowing that you're outmanned. But the question is, why were they outmanned in the first place? We have a little more clarity on that. But more importantly, why is it that we still have these apologists for law enforcement who are clearly in favor of what we experienced, right? Want to enable it. We have an issue with white supremacy within our law enforcement. That's been well documented as well, and I'll give you some more details in that in just a second. But Nando, my question to you is, okay, so what do? We just let it go? We just let this kind of shit happen over and over again, and all right, it is what it is. I mean, we don't have any answers. We just know that we don't like militarism. We don't like these government agencies. We know that they abuse their power all the time. So what is the answer? I guess that's my question.
Well, I mean, I think it's broadly speaking the same answer that we would say to, the flip side of that, which is what's our answer to, the sort of overly aggressive responses to the Black Lives Matter protests. Or it's the same thing as kind of our response to the rioters, for example, in over the summer after the George Floyd protest that destroyed things. It's like these things, these behaviors, rioting and property damage, are the inevitable behavior of a system that produces the kind of misery and inequality that our system produces. And that a sort of punitive response to that is only going to make things worse. That unless you kind of change the underlying conditions, then you're going to get more and more of this. And the sort of instinct is a real one so you can't let this happen. I mean, you can't let a business just burn on the street, like that. You can't let that happen either. Like that's obviously an appalling thing that has happened. But the question is, what do you do about it? Do you ramp up the sort of policing aspect of it, or do you try to address the underlying conditions? And obviously, the presence of right-wing extremists within law enforcement is a terrifying problem, and it's one that's not new. I mean, OJ got off because
at all.
And OJ got off because Mark Furman was a literal Nazi, right? Like that, the cop who showed up, the LAPD guy who showed up to investigate the crime was a literal Nazi. That's one of the main reason why OJ got off. So, I mean, it's the flip side of the same thing, and it's like we can sort of say well, those people are worse than the people who are nominally on our side. But that's just not how it works in reality. What it works in reality is that all these things always end up rebounding back to our side and in much more violent and punitive ways. So that's what I think my instinct is to as horrifying as the scenes were in the Capitol, and there were there's no way around it. You can't minimize the shocking nature of it, but my instinct is always to let's put a pause on kind of our reaction to this, because often the reaction can only make things worse. I mean, it's the same in 9/11. It's just the same whenever we're shocked by something like this, some symbolically important and horrifying attack. Our instinct is we have to do something about it. We have to do something. It's the same thing when we see human rights abuses abroad, right? It's the Samantha Power argument. It's how can you stand by while hundreds of thousands of people are being murdered in Rwanda? It's like,
yeah, I know, but my issue is, and let me be absolutely clear for anyone who might mistake the way I'm talking about this as wanting more of a security state and a surveillance state. I do not want that. In fact, we already have an insanely robust security state. I mean, when you look at the images and the videos of the police force, working, or let me put it better. when you look at the police response to Black Lives Matter, it is abundantly clear that we already have an overly robust surveillance state and security state. There's no question. But I guess the point that I'm trying to get at is that we talk about these issues as if they're not asymmetric. They are asymmetric. We're talking about a group of people who were involved in the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer who really don't have much power. Let's keep it real. No power. And then we look at the other side, and they have the police on their side. They have, obviously an abundance of weaponry on their side. They have much more power on their side. And I think that we make the mistake of talking about them as if they're all, these disenfranchised, working class white people who have just had enough. But that's not even the case. I mean, you look at the demographics of who voted for Biden versus Trump, and Trump, yes, had some appeal among working class white people, but you break it down. Let's go to the last graphic that I have in my that I ordered. You look at that, and people making under $50,000 overwhelmingly voted for Biden over Trump. And then as you go further down this graph, this bar graph, you see people who made more than $100,000. Most of them voted for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not some populist who's, specifically appealing to people who are poor in this country. Donald Trump, as you mentioned in your segment, immediately passed massive tax cuts for the rich, immediately passed massive tax cuts for corporations without getting rid of the deductions and loopholes that they have been enjoying for decades now. He didn't, and guess what? The support for Trump among his base only grew. They only became more devoted to him. And so I think that there are real questions of identity here that need to be addressed, real questions of power that need to be addressed. And I just think that on the left, we keep talking about these things as if okay, here are the solutions we don't like. And what we need to do is just change, the economic injustice that fuels a lot of what we're experiencing right now. But I don't think that that's the full answer either. I think there are issues of identity that play a role in what happened in the Capitol that also need to be addressed. And I'm not really sure how to address it.
Obviously, it goes back to the argument that, the straw man argument that Hillary made about we're breaking up the banks and racism. It's no, it won't end racism. It won't end the prejudice that exists in people's hearts. The question is, when do we see, if we look at history, when do we see the sort of far-right extremism and far-right extremist violence? Under what conditions are those things allowed to really take root? I mean, are you ever going to eliminate it 100%? Probably not. But the question is in what conditions do they actually take root and can take power? And those, broadly speaking, are in conditions of economic collapse. That's just been true. That's true in the past, and it's true today. I mean, it's not a coincidence that we're seeing this in the decade after the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, there's just no way you can understand anything that's going on now without understanding that. And when people make the point that Trump's base is not immiserated working poor people, that's obviously true. But it is true that in 2016 he did peel off enough to make the difference in the swing states that mattered. And then he largely lost those people in 2020. I mean, that was why he lost the election, is because working class white men abandoned him compared to 2016, because they saw that most of it was just a fraud, and that he did pass the tax cut and he didn't pass anything else to help them. But if you don't change, again, it's the same thing as always. I mean, I feel like we're beating a dead horse on this show in terms of what are the solutions to our problems? Broadly speaking, it's a working class movement that imposes a more just economic order. Will that end, rape and interpersonal racism? No, but it'll go a long way to help ameliorate those things, and it will go a long way to creating conditions in which a new type of politics can emerge, and creating the conditions in which this kind of extreme right-wing violence is just not appealing anymore to a lot of people. Again, that's just, it's not to say like, I mean, I'm not saying we don't have any solutions. I'm saying that the solutions are broadly difficult, but and I'm saying that
they're
we
long-term solutions that don't look. They're long-term solutions that do not address what we're experiencing right now, and I think that's part of the reason why I have an issue with the way that this is being discussed. Like, there are two things that have been frustrating, right? So, number one, there's been this pretty annoying effort to minimize what happened in the Capitol. What happened in the Capitol is not a joke. When we talk about attempted coups in countries like Venezuela, we call them what they are. They're attempted coups. The fact that they failed doesn't change the fact that the intention was a coup. These are individuals who were persuaded by Donald Trump's rhetoric for weeks to do what they did. And when you listen to the end of his speech on that very day, he's encouraging them to literally march to the Capitol, where everyone knows, every member of Congress and Vice President Mike Pence are certifying the Electoral College votes. And he even says something along the lines of, make sure that Mike Pence does the right thing. They went there with the intention of throwing out what was decided through a democratic process just to ensure that their guy remains in office, something that is undemocratic and unconstitutional, but they didn't care. What their intentions were does matter. I don't think that Donald Trump, getting elected out of office is the end of Trumpism. 75 million Americans voted for him. Those people still exist. Those people looked at the last 4 years of misery, the last 4 years of instability, the last year of hundreds of thousands of Americans dying as a result of his inability to properly address coronavirus. And they thought, no, that's our man. That's our guy. We're literally willing to risk everything to get another 4 years of this guy. So I don't think that we should be minimizing it on one hand. And then at the same time, I do think that it's important to address what short-term solutions we can focus on, if there are any. And if there are no short-term solutions, or at least there is no short-term solution from the perspective of the left, I don't know. I just think that's an issue because we are disorganized right now. We don't have a game plan. There is a lot of frustration and anger on the left, which has led to quite a bit of division, especially in the last few weeks. So I guess I'm just not satisfied with, we gotta organize and we gotta find long-term solutions. I agree with those solutions. I want to be clear about that. I absolutely agree that the organizing is critical, that changing the system is critical. But in the short term, if we're not allowed to, ban Trump from Twitter, if we're not allowed to, address the ever-growing right-wing extremism in this country in a way that does something about it right now, then what happens? We just let this continue to fester? I think that's where my issues are.
The question then is, the question is the impulse to do something. You got to do something, can't do nothing, right? Then you have to be very careful about these kind of things. There are, I agree. I'll put the example of Europe. Europe has on the books in many countries, very strict restrictions on Nazi speech. It's a crime in France to deny the Holocaust, and there's very punitive restrictions to the kinds of right-wing rhetoric that we would fear. This is the kind of thing that certain liberals and some people on the left here have been advocating for in the past few years. You know what the most potent political party in France is after the sort of kind of neoliberal centrist one? It's the far right xenophobic hard nationalist party, the Front National. Those laws did nothing to stop the sort of march of right-wing of right-wing extremism in that country. And this is something that's going on all over the Western world, this kind of phenomenon. And the question is, what are the solutions? I think it's pretty clear to me that banning Trump from Twitter will do nothing to stop the sort of the real kind of march towards the extreme right that this country is doing. I that's just my personal inclination is to think that's not going to do anything to stop that. And I do know that the effect of that will be to boomerang around to sort of start banning people who support BDS or support Palestinian rights or I know that's going to happen. That's 100% I can take that to the bank that's going to happen. So I just don't think that's the best way to deal with it. I think that there is something to elite impunity in this country. I mean, this is something that Glenn Greenwald wrote in his book, For Liberty and Justice for Some, that starting with the Nixon pardon from Gerald Ford in 1976, we've just seen a litany of crimes of people in government go unpunished or pardoned, from Iran-Contra to the Bush war criminals and blah, blah, blah. We can think about that. And I think that there is something to investigating the actual crimes of people in power, the Trump administration and things like that. And the sort of Obama look forward and not back on the Bush war criminals was a sort of tacit pardon for very serious crimes, and created a culture of impunity, or not created, but fomented a culture of impunity that I think we should stop at the sort of upper elite level. And maybe I can see that argument, but I think that the argument of like the FBI should be ramping up its investigation of quote unquote domestic terrorism, like I do know where that's going to go, and it's not going to really stop the right-wing violence. I mean, they might foil a plot here or two. You know, they're not like blanket.
They've been foiling quite a few plots, actually, among right-wing extremists, including what the plot was in Michigan, in response to the governor and what she was just trying to do to keep people safe during the pandemic. But yeah, keep going.
Well, I also know that they murdered Fred Hampton in 1972. You know, in his bedroom.
No, I get it. The FBI has done terrible things. I get it. Totally get it. But
it's not just.
But if we don't have an investigative body, like I get it. Like all of the critique and criticism toward the FBI is beyond warranted. But I guess again, my question is, all right, you investigate the crimes that are committed by politicians like Donald Trump. Okay, great. But I also remember the left being incredibly critical of the impeachment investigation, which was a foreshadowing moment, by the way, in what Trump was trying to do in, throwing out our democratic process and giving himself an upper hand in his reelection campaign. That was minimized. That was belittled. That turned out to be a huge joke. And that was also frustrating because he did something criminal there. There was a clear quid pro quo. He released the transcripts on his own, and he was withholding congressionally appropriated funds for Ukraine unless they announced some sham investigation into his political opponent. That's an issue, right? And it was kind of miraculous to me, like amazing to me, that the left just didn't think that was something that we should spend any time on. Give them a pass. Let's move on to something else. So it's just, even in situations where we can hold people in positions of power accountable, there's always this and it's not everyone in the left, but there's a portion of the left that seems to respond in this incredibly negative and enabling way. And I don't understand it.
I think the response to the impeachment issue and the impeachment that actually happened last year was that the focus of the impeachment inquiry was incredibly narrow to this one kind of Russia incident, which is who gives a shit? There's myriad actual kind of very widespread crimes that could be used to bring articles of impeachment, and that focusing it on this Russia thing, which no one cared about, literally no one cared about, took out all the teeth from it.
But the impeachment wasn't about Russia. I mean, the impeachment was specifically about him withholding congressionally appropriated funds to Ukraine, unless the leader of Ukraine announced a sham investigation into Joe Biden in order to hurt his chances of beating Trump in the election. That was the core of the issue, the quid pro quo. But I agree with you in that the impeachment investigation was too narrow in scope. I found it incredibly strange and suspicious that Democrats didn't want to investigate his financial ties and his financial dealings. I think that's a bigger issue that for some reason they decided to stay away from. But
or the kids in cages, kids in okay, you know what I mean? Like a crime that actually, I mean, the Ukraine quid pro quo thing, it was so nauseatingly small and complicated that no one understood it. No one cared about it. It had zero political effect. You know, I mean, that's the so it's as if they did nothing. You know, it's just it's the exact same thing. I mean, I think that was the sort of left criticism. If you're gonna do that, you might as well not do it. You know, but if you're gonna do like an actual impeachment investigation for like actual real serious crimes, like putting kids in concentration camps on the border, you know, like, or blatant self-dealing and enriching everyone in the administration and in, you know, everyone around you, like those are actual kind of crimes that are people can understand and people can rally around. And like this, like, you know, some Ukraine prosecutor like, it's just that I think that's the issue with the whole impeachment thing as it happened, you know? So again, I just think that there's it's so hard to like look at something horrific and think, what are the tools at our disposal? You know, I mean, I don't mean to bring this
we have none
up again, but
we have none. Like
again,
that's the issue. We have none.
Or like we do have some. They're like giant bazookas at the problem, you know, and the bazookas unfortunately like explode and kill a bunch of people. You know, like I mean, it's the same again. I come back to like when that's the political problem with the sort of you know, here in America of like, you know, getting overly angry or about some sort of foreign catastrophe is because what are the tools at our disposal? I mean, we have the military machine that we got. You know, if we had some theoretical other one, we could in theory design one from scratch, which would be able to deal with human rights abuses abroad in a way that actually, you know, brought the perpetrators accountability, like, you know, accountability, and also actually solved the problems that led to those things. But we don't. We have the war machine that we got, which is kills millions of people, costs trillions of dollars, and only makes things worse. So the instinct for me, whenever there is some foreign catastrophe, is like, don't do anything. Like the U.S. should not do anything. Like that's better than what we do.
Than doing something. Because there's a financial motive. There's a financial motive behind the actions we take abroad. And what we do over and over again, what our government does over and over again, is use the excuse of humanitarian crises in order to get involved. But that's never the actual intention or the actual motivating factor behind why, you know, we utilize our military in these so-called human rights abuse situations. It's all about exploiting that talking point in order to sell more weapons. I mean, we talk about this all the time. Sell more weapons. We're experiencing that right now in Asia. We're selling more weapons to Japan than ever before because of this, you know, trumped up threat of China. And so I agree with you on all of that. But I definitely agree with you as well about abuses of power and how the government specifically exploits moments where Americans are scared in order to roll back our rights, our liberties, and abuse their power further, you know, both domestically and abroad. So we agree on that point. I just think, and I don't think either one of us really have the answer, right? So I'm not like specifically calling you out. I just think that, you know, we need to find solutions for doing something about the short term, like what we're experiencing in the short term. Because again, I agree with you. I don't think that banning Trump from Twitter is going to, you know, completely obliterate what he's built with this giant group of people who think it's totally fine to go and storm into the Capitol building and threaten people's lives. How do we address it? Like the Democratic Party is not fit to lead at all. We don't have any power on the left right now. We're not organized. What do we do in the short term? And I guess it's an open-ended question. I don't know if anyone on the left really has answers to it. All I know is what comes across, at least online from the left, has been this climate of kind of minimizing it, right? And I don't know if that's what the intention is. I doubt it. But what that does to people is make them kind of passive. Like it makes them think that this isn't like a serious situation, and it is. And we do need to think about short-term solutions. We need to have discussions about short-term solutions. We're nowhere close, Nando. You know it. We're nowhere close to being organized enough to change the system under which this kind of disgusting behavior, ideology, brutality has grown. So what do we do in the short term? That's my question. You know?
I think that because we have no power, that if we to the extent that we have any sort of influence, I think pulling people away from the precipice of doing something damaging is probably the best short-term thing that we can do.
I agree.
I mean, like opposing this domestic terrorism law, as cathartic as that might feel, like that's kind of what I'm reminded. I don't think many liberals got this when they watched The Watchmen, which had some very wonky politics. But one of the provocations of the new HBO show Watchmen was like, what if liberals got all they want in terms of basically like a woke fascist state? And that's like what it was, like where they kind of beat down on white supremacists using like an authoritarian police, and where Henry Louis Gates kind of enforced a sort of ministry of propaganda of wokeness. Like that's what it was. That was the provocation at the heart of it. And that's a world that I don't want to, I don't want to participate in. I don't want to participate in that, in a march towards a sort of a liberal version of an authoritarian state. Like I
totally agree.
I would rather, that's what I would say in the short term that we can do on the left is kind of maybe pull people off the precipice of and again, it's that delicate dance of you don't want to say this is nothing, this is unimportant, this is not, but we have to be sort of careful about the solutions. And I think that broadly speaking, empowering the FBI and tech oligarchs essentially to manage our political system is something that I would be very, very wary of. But anyway, I don't know. Should we bring on young Cale to see what he what he thinks? And he's chomping at the bits. Is it chomping at the bits or at the bit?
I think bit, but I could be wrong.
Well, for today's show, it's Chomskying
at the bit.
Right. He's going to be on in a moment. People in the comments are like, "Where's Chomsky?" And it's like, "Sorry, we're Chomsky now." But he's coming in just a sec. And it is pre-recorded, so he won't have anything to say about what's going on, unfortunately. But his wisdom, I think, extends beyond the day-to-day, and he still actually does end up saying something relevant to what's happened. I mean, part of it, there's a couple things I want to throw into the mix. I mean, part of it with Trump getting banned from Twitter, for instance, my sense is not that Trump was banned because of the Twitter execs saying, fine, enough's enough. We can't tolerate this kind of speech anymore. We can't tolerate, this kind of behavior. My sense is that ads were starting to pull their funding into Twitter, that they don't want an ad to pop up next to the president while all this is going on. And my guess is it was economic, that they said, shit, we're losing money by keeping the president on the platform. We're going to pull our funding, or we're going to get rid of the president's Twitter account so that we can resume having ads on our site. And what this kind of ultimately comes back to, in some sense, is it's just one more example of the typical leftist critique, or the socialist critique of the last 100 or so years of government, of the state, which is that ultimately what is running everything is the economic system. It's corporations need to make money, they need to make profits, and so much of what happens in politics, not everything, of course not everything, but at the end of the day, they end up having a veto power over, does the president of the United States get to use a social media platform, right? Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, this is unprecedented, and in other ways, it's really not at all unprecedented. This is just kind of corporations having their say in government, like they do regularly, of saying, yeah, there's certain things that are outside of our scope of what makes us money, and we're not going to allow those things. So, and so much of the security state is that as well, of this is a means to keeping the system chugging along, making more profits. And so I would just add to the, and I think we were kind of getting to this already in the conversation, but for something like, how do we deal with terrorism, or how do we deal with violent groups? I think in some ways, I think a lot of what you guys have both said is useful and thoughtful, and I think you're right to say, like, I don't know if there's a great immediate answer. I would just add that, part of what the left has to figure out right now is how to establish priorities. And in many ways, there's certain things that, because we're so powerless, we just can't really do much about this issue. And so we can say, well, with our limited abilities and resources and efforts, we can push for maybe this isn't the right thing. We can campaign around Medicare for all or something. That's been an ongoing campaign for years. Maybe that is the solution to this situation, that, we're going to continue to push for Medicare for all. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's, we should be organizing around COVID checks, or we should be organizing around, keeping Biden to his promises on infrastructure. I don't know. I mean, I think this is something that the left has to figure out. But I think we should always be thinking of this in terms of, what can we do given our limited capacity as, mostly a fighting force that actually still has to go to work most of their waking life and does this stuff in their after hours. So, and that's the other thing with, like, these people in DC with these protesters, like, it's mostly middle-class people. It's mostly, like, small business owners, like, as Anna was saying a moment ago.
CEOs.
Yeah, I mean, although, interestingly enough, a lot of corporations have come out and denounced this. So, yeah, again, the business community does not like this kind of action. Regardless, and it does seem pretty clear that there was some coordination internally of, that this was all planned publicly. So someone in the national security state or in the DC police was like, whatever, let's see what happens. But at the same time, corporate America is not terribly interested in mob violence or kind of a rise of American fascism or something. I think they're fine with business as usual, and they want to be able to suppress little flare-ups here and there by protesters on the left and the right. But by and large, like, they just want to keep making profits. And so, again, I think in some ways, I think the left, and it's not easy by any means, I think the left has to become as ruthless about establishing our political priorities as our true enemies, our true opponents, capitalist corporate America. They are as ruthless in their pursuit of profit, like, because they will, without even thinking about it, without even needing to coordinate between corporations, between businesses, between capitalists, they can squash us so easily because it's just in their interest to do so. But
yeah. And since you mentioned the people involved, like their background and where they're at economically, I think it's also important to mention that there were literally off-duty police officers and members of the military who engaged in that riot.
Totally.
And again, it goes back to the point that I was bringing up regarding the asymmetric nature of what's going on right now. Again, we're talking about a group of right-wingers who have bought into all of the disinformation we've experienced throughout the last 4 years. They're well armed. They have the police on their side. They are the police in some cases. And we don't have that on the left. And to your point, Cale, and also your point, Nando, I agree about the risk you take with the surveillance state and censorship online, because I do think that this is really about ensuring that advertisers aren't uncomfortable with, the platform, Twitter specifically. And if you have Donald Trump threatening Capitol, what do you think they're going to do to the left when the whole point is to challenge Capitol? Of course, they're going to, turn their ire against us, ban us, censor us. That is something to be concerned about. That's a legitimate point. But then that does raise the issue of disinformation, propaganda, and how potent that's been. because it has radicalized people. The young woman who was shot and killed by Capitol Police inside the Capitol building during this riot was actually a 2-time Obama supporter. Like, she voted for Obama in both elections, thought he was fantastic, and then ended up voting for Trump specifically because she hated Hillary Clinton. But throughout the years, she became radicalized by QAnon and all of these, right-wing message boards and forums. And so how do you effectively fight back against that disinformation? That's also a question, right? Without leading to more bans, more censorship, that, of course, will have unintended consequences for us.
Well, I think that the real issue with that is like who gets to decide, right? And if it's our like democracy that gets to decide, that's largely speaking better, and that's how it kind of used to be. I mean, if we think about right-wing propaganda in this country, it's always kind of been there, but it really kind of took off in the way we understand it today, with the rise of right-wing talk radio in the 1980s and 90s, and then Fox News essentially in the late 90s, and that came to happen out of deregulation of the public airwaves. Like that was a very specific result of deregulatory processes in the public airwaves. Before that, the public airwaves were regulated by the government, which is, broadly speaking, democratically elected. You know what I mean? So it's we kind of chose that in a way, and then it was deregulated, and then so now the impulse should not be that no regulation of media is warranted. I do think that the healthiest societies that we have in the world have some sort of media regulation, and by the way, they also have a very robust public media, which is owned by us and controlled by us. I think that's another like kind of part of it. I'm a big advocate for public media. Like I think that there's ways to structure it. The fear is always that like, whatever president's going to just like decide what the public media does. There's ways to structure it in which it's still publicly owned, but independent of whatever, latest party is in power. But broadly speaking, it's that it's we should be the ones controlling that, not Twitter fucking Jack with his Burning Man beard and his intermittent fasting. No, but see, like that's what I'm talking about. Like that's a good short-term solution. And when I say short-term, it's not like it's going to be easy to accomplish that, right? But at least it's like a specific thing that the left can prioritize to get it enacted as soon as possible. Like and it's not something, in my opinion, as difficult as, doing away with private industry in healthcare and sticking to a single payer healthcare system. That is an incredibly difficult thing to pass, right? We know that. We've experienced how difficult it is. But I think most people understand, regardless of where you are on the ideological spectrum, that we do have an issue with disinformation right now. And also and it's not just disinformation by right-wingers. It's disinformation that's specifically protecting the elites and capitalism and profits, right? That's an issue as well. So, yeah, I love that, and I want to explore that a little more. I always say that the biggest, most consequential bit of misinformation and fake news in my life was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction propagated by the liberal New York Times. And the New York Times was the key news outlet to propagate that lie. And it had the most consequential effect of any bit of fake news, certainly in my lifetime. And I think that's important to understand, that like liberal misinformation is just, is out there, and it kind of drives the libs crazy. I mean, that's how we get a situation in which, even though voters agree with Bernie Sanders' policies, like on every single one, they flock to Joe Biden because they're just being told by these
out of fear.
Liberal, they're basically being whipped up into kind of frenzied, fear-ridden people by our liberal media, like whether it's, the biggest offender is obviously MSNBC, but CNN as well, and New York Times to a certain degree. So and again, I think that this comes as a result of we don't have a robust public media. We don't have like the public, like the news is vital to a society. It's information, like a society needs information about itself to be able to make decisions about itself. Therefore, it's a public good. You know, like just like the air we breathe is a public good because we need it to survive. Just like clean water is a public good because we need it to survive. The information is that as well. So we should own it. We should control it, not private tyrannies, right? I mean, that's like that's always been Chomsky's kind of case. Who's gonna speak in a second? You know, like anyway, that and that's that. I mean, if we're talking about disinformation, I think that we overrate the effect of social media, broadly speaking, and we underrate, which isn't to say that it's a problem, but we underrate the effect of boring ass TV news, whether it's local news, whether it's the cable news, which is still the vast majority of people get the vast majority of their news through those sources. It's the most addicting kind in a certain way. People watch tons of TV still, even, you know, like as millennials or cord cutters or whatever. If you look at the numbers, like the vast majority of like people above a certain age just like are hooked on their TV still. And it's just, that's a huge source of it. And it's the question is, how do we deal with it? I don't think we should let Mark Zuckerberg decide. I just don't. I'm sorry. Like,
right, but I would say that there's two sides to this though, right? Because at the same time that everything you said is correct, you also have to have a population that is willing to take in that information, that like them hearing, you know, the elites are corrupt, or the the liberal media is lying to you, you know, like the Rush Limbaugh crowd, like there has to be some truth to the claim. And so of course, like what you're saying, both with like, you know, the New York Times being pro-war, or I mean, a lot of like these QAnon people, a lot of the Trump support comes out of the fact that, like, because again, most of the active people in this are middle class people. They're small business owners. Like they, you know, the floor fell out from underneath them in 2008 and 2009. And so much of the recovery ended up falling onto them. Like the Tea Party comes about when it comes about because like they end up shouldering a lot of the economic responsibility of like, you know, getting out of the recession. And so and what happens is like it's this deep reaction where like there is no left alternative to Obama present available. So like the opposition to Obama is the Republicans, and then this like astroturfed grassroots, I'm sorry, I'm doing scare quotes, you know, grassroots right-wing phenomenon known as the Tea Party, which eventually turns into Trumpianism, turns into QAnon, turns into conspiracy theories. And of course, like the middle class has been falling. I mean, Barbara Ehrenreich wrote like a book in the 80s on like fear of falling. Like the middle class has like been in precarity for several decades. You know, it should go without saying that the working class has been in precarity since like that's basically what it means to be working class, is to be in a state of precarity. Aside from like a blip in history when we actually had unions, but outside of that, you know, strong fighting unions, militant unions. But for middle class people, you know, when there's not that like we're going to convert all of these small business owners into being on the left, but, you know, this kind of reaction, this kind of conspiracy theory where it's like, yeah, the elites are fucking you over and they're all pedophiles and they secretly
some degree
have
of truth.
Arrested. Yeah, there's some degree of truth. But like we're like Obama and Hillary and all these people have been secretly jailed by Trump, and like there's something about like the Kennedy who died in the plane crash in the 90s, like orchestrating this. And
John Jr. with his with his magazine.
Right. Yeah. Well,
it's the funniest thing about the whole thing is like the funniest part about it.
But the thing is that like, you know, so like some of those people, like a lot of the people who went, you know, I don't want to say all, in fact, I would say some of the people who went as protesters to the Capitol this week probably aren't going to be receptive to a left political message. But like the woman who passed away, who was shot and killed by police in the Capitol building, who had voted for Obama in the past, I think there's a chance where like that kind of person could have been reached with a politics of redistribution, a politics of like guaranteeing greater personal freedom through like making sure that you have security in your life, like economic security, rather than like kind of these phony, like, we're going to build a wall, or, we got to get rid of the pedophiles. Like, the left doesn't want the pedophile elites either. Like, but we think that the way that you deal with the ruling class is through organizing working people, through organizing a labor movement. I think a lot of people on the right, like, although the left should not agree with certain political stances, especially certain social and cultural stances, but at the same time, like, I think there's room, and in fact, there's a necessity in the future to bring some of those people over to our side and say, like, we actually have so much more to gain by fighting together for something like guaranteed checks, pushing the administration on that, or healthcare, public news, and small newspapers across the country covering like what's going on in people's actual lives, rather than just kind of like what the algorithm spits up of just like conspiracy nonsense.
So I get you on that, and I wholeheartedly agree. But something that's been coming up a lot more in my thinking recently, and I want to make sure I differentiate between, supporters and voters on the right wing who maybe fell for some of Donald Trump's populist language in 2016, and just separate them from the people that I'm specifically talking about now, which is, the right-wing populists who have, this desire for authoritarianism, right? Like, that exists. And how do we account for that? How do we reconcile that? And how do we effectively reject that while simultaneously appealing to people on the right who are reachable and actually do believe in democracy? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Broadly speaking, I think that you're never going to win over everyone, and there's always people who are just kind of like fascists in their heart, and they're just, that's an instinct that happens in people, and that's true. But like, it is true that a lot of people are more complex, and it's just, and they respond to a variety of different inputs throughout their lives, and their kind of views change, and they don't really understand why they're changing and things like that. And broadly speaking, these big social forces are what, on the whole, lead to this kind of thing. I mean, if you look at the people who did the Capitol riots, yes, it's true, they're mostly the petty bourgeois, which is Trump's base, so that makes sense. Which, by the way, is always been the base of any sort of fascist takeover. Always, in every country, has always been, that's always been the case, whether it's in Italy with kind of like, small landed gentry, same within Spain, same in Germany. Like, that's always the base of the of like the most extreme right-wing authoritarianism. Do they make certain
India today?
Same in India today.
Brazil.
Do they make certain inroads into the working class that's been abandoned by the political system that is enough to change the balance of power? Yes, but the real big, and that's where people get confused, and that's where people think like this like they make the joke of like look at all this economic anxiety. It's like, you have to have a slightly better understanding of history to to know that joke is nonsense. Like that right. Yes, of course, the base of fascism is always these kind of petty bourgeois, and then it really flips once like the ultra capital, like the sort of real capitalists are like, okay, yeah, we're just going to go with these guys because the left is too powerful and we're scared of them. So that's why that's one of the reasons why I'm not like afraid of a sort of real coup fascist takeover in this country, mostly because there is no powerful left to fear. And that's always what like fascism is, a response to that. But I think that broadly speaking, like, we have to have a coherent message with a clear enemy and a clear kind of politics around it that appeals to people's self-interest, that appeals to people's kind of real base self-interest, not their kind of morals or their ethics or anything like that. It's like, we will make your life better with this political program. And we will peel off certain people. We will peel off enough people. That's all you need. You need enough people. You're not going to get everyone. You're not going to get there's definitely bad people in the world. You're not going to get everyone, but you just that's the only alternative. That is the only alternative. That's the only solution that there is. And it's hard to stick to your guns on it. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I admire Bernie, and I think why he's been so successful compared to other people on like that are ideologically aligned with him, other politicians, in which he does not chase, you know, the rabbit that's kind of like bursting out of every angle. Like he sticks to his guns. He knows his message. He always pivots back to it. No matter what is happening, he always pivots back to it. And it's, broadly speaking, a message of economic self-interest to the vast majority of people. That's something like people like AOC could learn, you know, from him, and to just like it's so tempting, like when you're in it, when you're in something and shit is happening all over the place, and shit is bad all over the place, and it's gonna keep happening, and it's gonna keep being bad, and more shit's gonna happen. Like, don't get me wrong, like bad shit is coming down the pike. The question is, can you maintain a certain level of discipline, and can you maintain a certain level of restraint and not sort of chasing whatever new solution pops up, because the vast majority of them, because of the power arrangements and the power structures of this country, are only going to rebound back to the most vulnerable, and broadly speaking, the left. I mean, I think that's just the. And it is somewhat unsatisfying, because
I mean, look, it's not just unsatisfying. It just means doing nothing in the short term. Like, when I say doing nothing, I mean doing nothing to find solutions in the short term. Like, it just kind of goes back to, here's what we need to do. It's going to take a super long time, and then in the meantime, what? You know, in the meantime, things are just going to be awful and continue to be awful and get worse. And the thing that's terrifying is the next 4 years are only going to continue emboldening what we saw in the Capitol, in my opinion. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily going to lead to things as violent as what we saw, but I mean, I agree. Like, you can try to ban them on social media. You know, you can try to silence Donald Trump. But those 75 million Americans who voted for him still exists. Biden is certainly not going to provide any solutions to any of this that actually address the underlying issues, including income inequality. And so these problems and these divisions are only going to get worse over the next 4 years. And what I'm most scared of is what follows Biden's first term. That's terrifying.
That's where, like, fighting for checks right now is an immediate thing that the left should be rallying around. That we should. That will
help blunt a lot of the bad stuff. It will. I mean, it won't eliminate it, but it'll help blunt its appeal a little bit.
Well, it'll help de-escalate the situation. That it's, you know, when it's become almost like a, I don't know. People throw this around so often of just like, America's super polarized. It's a land of contrasts, but like it is deeply polarized, and it is like only going to get worse in the way that Anna's describing. But I think, like, you know, a lot of that is because, like, most Americans probably are not even that tuned into what's just happened this week, because most Americans are still trying to figure out, how do I pay my rent? Like, how do I deal with this virus? How do I, like, keep my job? Like, a lot of people are unemployed. Like, you know, some people unemployed are tuning into all this, and some people are saying, screw this, screw everything. Like, so I think part of it to prove, because I think a big part of the left political project going into the future has to be, like, making the case that public goods can exist, that, like, the state can actually provide things in your life, and, like, actually do it in a decent, competent way, where, like, it's not just there to, like, screw you over one more time. Like, it shouldn't become, like, mega boss on top of your actual boss. Well, then there's the government that then just screws you over even more. Like, we have to, you know, part of it, and I think the checks, you know, just, you know, not that this is, like, anything that's, like a conscious effort, but hopefully something like if the Democrats are successful in passing checks, which I still don't put past the Democrats having full control of government to pass these 2,000 checks, but we'll see, hopefully.
I mean, Manchin's already squashed it.
Yeah, right.
I mean, just absolute garbage. I'm sure
question
people
is-
in
the
West
question is,
Virginia
will
are
one of-
struggling economically right now.
Will some of the Republicans
sorry, go
peel
ahead.
off? They might over this. They might.
I hope
that's
so.
where-
I mean,
You know, to the extent that politics is still, unfortunately, mostly a spectator sport, you know, even though we've had Bernie, even though we've had the rise of grassroots organizations, like, we're still mostly looking at this from the outside with very little influence on what's going on inside. You know, and of course, like, that's some of the biggest irony of this whole thing of, like, the protesters, like, you know, infiltrating the Capitol, of, like, these people that, like, so hate the government, so hate the elites, and, like, finding themselves all alone in the rotundas, like our guy with the horns, I already forgot his name.
QAnon shaman.
QAnon shaman.
Don't forget it.
Like, yeah, I mean, like, there's no better, like, illustration of, like, I said this the other night on, like, the Jacobin show. There's no other better illustration of, like, you know, politicians ruling the void than, like, the empty rotunda and, like, protesters in there, like, all right, I guess what now? Like, we're just gonna, you know, sit in some desks. We're gonna, you know, break some stuff. We're gonna steal some stuff. Like, so, you know, I think demonstrating that, like, government can actually do something positive is going to be a challenge for us to show. I mean, it's such we're, like, starting from literally nothing, that, you know, to say, like, actually, you know, and again, between the Trump administration passing tax cuts, like, being, like, that being basically the only legislative achievement outside of, you know, also, like, re-upping, like, a trade deal, and the Obama era having very little to show for itself, like, there is no good recent examples in, like, the last few decades of either administration, like, actually effectively pushing through legislation at all, or especially anything that, like, is in the interest of working people. So
yeah, everyone needs to read. Like, Master in the Senate is a must read, like, to understand power. It's about LBJ, but it's real, like, the real topic that's being addressed in this series of books by Robert Caro is how to actually understand your power and to use it. And what really stood out to me from learning about how LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act is how little he cared about morality. Like, I don't know if that's the right word, but he really didn't care about what liberals at that time, and liberals today as well, seem to put above doing the right thing, which is just appearing to be good people, appearing to be good, moral, ethical people. LBJ's like, no, I want to win. Right. At the heart of what he did was wanting to win. Now, of course, you know, he's got an awful history with Vietnam and all of that. But in terms of his victories in the Senate, what really stood out to me was his unwillingness to give into this effort for purity, you know, and we see a lot of that right now on the left. And we need to, I think we need to reject it. Like, this whole debate about, oh, is this person progressive? Is this person actually a leftist? Like, just, what are we doing to win? And right now, nothing. That's what we're doing to win. Nothing. We're allowing these ridiculous debates about whether or not someone is a good person enough distract us from thinking strategically and prioritizing in a way that leads to victory, that leads to winning.